Believe it or not, reality television is nearly 80 years old, with the first reality show airing in 1948. It was called Candid Camera. In case you don't know, this was a hidden camera show intended to pull pranks by putting unsuspecting subjects in embarrassing, confusing, or funny situations, usually while running routine errands or attending ordinary places. It was televised between 1948 to 2014 and saw a broad range of renditions, adaptations, and pranks in this time span. You can find rare clips from the very oldest version of this show on social media today, including the 1948 episode with unsuspecting children led to believe that this mailbox was alive simply because it contained a microphone.
How are you gonna go to sleep?
Well, the mailman will be around with a blanket for me. You see?
Even the children's mother in this clip was genuinely amazed by this prank afforded by technology, saying, and people generally remember this early show with the same fond amusement, with the comment sections of these old clips expressing mostly positive sentiments toward the show, though some may say that many of these comments are covertly negative towards something much broader and unrelated, like society today. I mean comments like these. Comments that say TV just isn't as funny as it was in these perhaps simpler times. And while we could just write these off as the gripes of people who can't get with the modern day, there's actually something much more interesting about these comments. They aren't true, or at least their positive sentiments toward the content weren't widely shared with its contemporary critics. Just check the paper. In 1948, some found Candid Camera to be offensive, maybe even cruel. Others said it just didn't work that well. Philip Hamburger of The New Yorker called the show sadistic, poisonous, anti-human, and sneaky, and stated that it was a conspicuous example of basic contempt for the dignity of man. Moreover, it was 1948 after all. This was the very start of the Cold War, an era marked by rampant paranoia about surveillance. Perhaps this political backdrop alone made people hesitant to tune in, at least at first. And in 1948, some felt that Candid Camera, which had started as solely a hidden microphone radio show called Candid Mic, was destined to fail. Some felt that the sudden surge in this new thing called television would end the successful radio program, that this kind of unscripted show was just a desperate scramble from a radio personality to keep up in the new entertainment age. As if this kind of unscripted show about real people wouldn't last long in the day of television. But of course, it turns out that Candid Camera was pretty ahead of its time, and reality TV was only getting started.
There's people that are dying.
I was rooting for you. We were all rooting for you. How dare you?
Oh, that's very profound.
The winner of American Idol 2002 is Kelly Clarkson.
Hi. You're both high.
You gonna call me a runner-up? You ain't never won nothing.
I don't know.
What is Hallmark?
But if I were ever pass you along in life again, and you were laying there dying of thirst, I would not give you a drink of water.
Okay, what is it? Reality TV. In a book by this very name, written by film, television, and media studies professor Misha Kafka, we learn that it's tough to define, and that when people try, the proposed definition is pretty disputable. Kafka mentions that shows such as The Jersey Shore, Cops, American Idol, and 16 and Pregnant have little in common, but also that people, quote, use the term in full confidence that they will be understood. While many consider 1948's Candid Camera the first reality show, Most would say that it wasn't until the early 90s that the word actually took off and became its own distinct genre. During the first decades of its run, Candid Camera was filmed from a single camera at a single location at a time. It wasn't until the 80s when camcorders became widely available, portable, and fairly inexpensive that reality TV could really take on new formats that followed the action and the people around, rather than just catching small moments in single places. Pair this new technology with the writer strike of 1988, and we got a recipe for a novel yet inexpensive type of programming that required no paid writers or actors. From here, the genre snowballed with new shows like 1992's The Real World. And most would say that the genre had clearly struck gold when more than 50 million people tuned in for the season finale of Survivor Season 1 in the year 2000. From here, reality TV reached its heyday in the early 2000s with a vast array of successful reality TV classics like Big Brother, The Osbournes, Fear Factor, and dozens more. And with unprecedentedly high viewership in a television genre, naturally people saw opportunities to get famous, to advertise, and to spread a political agenda. But it turns out that people seeing reality TV as an opportunity for gains, including the spread of their own agenda, was not new. Just as reality TV is nearly 80 years old, so is the idea of using it to spread a political message or ideology. Today, we're going to examine the covert political messaging in 3 different reality shows, starting with the first one ever made. We'll talk about how these shows and their ideals are misremembered too. Sometimes it's hard to believe the extent to which these shows and their political ideals are misremembered, because sometimes the visionary behind the program was quite open about the message they wanted to spread. At least, this was the case with Candid Camera. Chapter 2. What can we learn from Candid Camera? Candid Camera's conception and success was largely the work of one man, Alan Funt. A 1934 fine arts graduate from Cornell, Funt also served in the United States Army Signal Corps during World War II. One of his projects at that time was the creation of a radio show that addressed soldiers' complaints. The show was called The Gripe Booth. Funt noticed, however, that when soldiers saw the red recording light, they tended to get tongue-tied. His solution was to conceal the fact that he was recording them, getting them to engage in what they thought was just a bit of casual banter and more candid, off-the-record discussion first. In 1947, after Funt's discharge and return to New York, he created Candid Mike, a hidden microphone show that celebrated the, quote, beauty of everyday conversation. The very next year, the show took to television. While it was met with criticism, like we discussed, of course it could not have had a 7-decade run if nobody liked it. Networks, of which it had many throughout the years, liked the show's broad sense of humor and the fact that it was inexpensive to make. By the year 1960, the vast majority of Americans suddenly owned televisions, and that's the decade when the show really took off. In fact, it became so popular that by 1969, when Funt happened to be a passenger on a flight that was hijacked to Cuba, some people were relieved to see him on board, believing that this was a prank. It wasn't, and everyone went to Cuba for 11 hours. Many of the most memorable early pranks on the show included ones where unsuspecting victims thought they were working at new jobs. This includes the office worker with the copy machine spitting out paper after paper, or the bakery cook who is supposed to put whipped cream on cakes at warp speed, or the new secretary at a fitness center with a trampoline in the lobby. In this bit, a client asks to test it out before bouncing through the ceiling and disappearing. But the show wasn't only fun and games. Funt was spreading a political message as well. And though we may forget this today, it was no secret back then. Whenever Funt was interviewed, he often stressed his concerns about, quote, conformity and weakness in the face of authority. Totalitarianism was no small topic at the time. Here are just 2 reasons why. First, in the days after World War II, people had to confront the impact of the atrocities committed by totalitarian regimes. Of course, there was fear that such brutalities could happen again. And second, after World War II, the USA experienced great economic prosperity. Throw in the fact that there was a tightly pent-up demand for consumer goods, homes, and perhaps a little bit of fun after the difficult years at war. This was a recipe for mass consumerism. Critics began to argue that this newfound emphasis on materialism was encouraging conformity that came at the expense of critical thinking. At the same time, however, people were wildly afraid not to conform with social expectations and all-American values because of the Red Scare and ensuing McCarthyism movement. In this era, people accused of having communist ideals or sympathies were invasively surveilled and investigated. They were then punished through industry blacklisting, ruined careers, and in rare cases, even imprisonment. So essentially, Americans were facing a dilemma. They didn't necessarily want a society that lacked critical thinking and individuality, elements that allow a totalitarian regime to thrive, but at the same time, in the age of the Red Scare, they weren't exactly feeling emboldened to run around shouting about these concerns. But someone with a voice, with power, and a lot of money perhaps could. In Fred Nottis's article, a primary source for my research on this show, Nottis suggests that Funt was essentially creating a comedic inversion of the HUAC hearings during the Red Scare. This makes me think that, to some extent, the original Candid Camera was a parody. It parodied government efforts to surveil and ensure all-American values, mocked the seriousness with which McCarthy and his followers sought out communist sympathizers, and playfully reassured the common man that there was nothing to fear. At the same time, Funt wasn't afraid to explicitly stress the perils of blind submission to authority. One famous example was the elevator bit, in which actors joined an unsuspecting surveilled victim in an elevator. The actors entered the elevator so that their backs awkwardly faced the door. Without fail, the victims would slowly and casually turn the same way as the actors. In one particular go at this prank, a young man on the elevator is wearing a hat. An operative takes off his hat, and then, of course, so does the surveilled victim. Funt's voiceover, competing with audience laughter, offers a warning about conformity. In another early skit, Funt demonstrates the foolishness of blind obedience by showing a handful of customers in a shoe repair store who unquestioningly comply with a sign that tells them to please only step on the black squares of the checkerboard floor. And while it's difficult to make a case against Funt's messaging here, that it is okay not to submit blindly to authority, and that it is okay to question the authority of strangers in an elevator or a faceless sign, this is still nevertheless an example of a political agenda being promoted via reality television. But what about TV shows with more controversial messaging? And what about when the messaging is more covert? Chapter 3. The surprising truth about the surprising truth you learned about Extreme Makeover Home Edition. We're going to fast forward in time, quite a bit. As we talked about in the intro, for a variety of reasons, reality television took a long break between Candid Camera and the years that it actually evolved into its own distinct and popular genre. But when reality TV finally did come into its own,
Bring me my red back with my makeup.
it dominated popular culture. And so it has actually been studied by scholars. And one general consensus in academic works is that reality television is a technology of neoliberalism. We won't get too technical, but real quick in case you don't know. Neoliberalism is basically an economic ideology that prioritizes free market capitalism, individual responsibility, and limited government intervention, including when it comes to social welfare. The scholarly idea is that this agenda is enforced through many different types of reality shows. For example, theoretically, shows like Survivor and The Amazing Race enforce the notion of the level playing field or promote the American dream, that anyone can get rich if they just try hard enough. Shows like Big Brother perhaps treasure the facets of the neoliberal workplace, promoting ideals like team conformity, submission to authority, and having to be authentically positive while adhering to the goals of an institution. This last part, authentically positive, reminds me of the minimum wage jobs I've worked in which we're expected to smile. No, smile like you mean it. People needed to present themselves on the show as authentically positive, unless of course they wanted to be disliked and criticized by all of America. Other shows underline different values of neoliberalism, perhaps setting out to prove that struggling families don't need social welfare to solve their problems, but perhaps just need charity. Perhaps the problems with society is that individuals aren't charitable enough. Maybe charity from the rich and famous could help us all out.
This is unacceptable. This isn't okay for the kids.
And of course, reality TV shows have the potential to take this argument that we should limit welfare systems even further with shows like Honey Boo Boo. In these cautionary tale types of shows, a case is made that some people are beyond help. These are shows about white trash stereotypes. These shows also warn viewers that those who cannot find their way into productive, respectable society are doomed to look a certain way, namely stupid, criminal, racist, dirty, lazy, and riddled with addiction. And perhaps the biggest takeaway message is a neoliberalistic, see, why should we be helping these people anyway? Now, this video would probably end up being several hours long if we wanted to dig into all of these, so I want to talk about just one of these shows, Extreme Makeover Home Edition. I chose this one because I think this show gets widely misremembered in a few different ways, and I think it's perhaps the most interesting out of all the shows I have already referenced in this chapter because this one just feels the most innocent. It's uplifting, it's all about helping people, and its episodes always have a happy ending. But let's get into what it is that we get wrong about this show. First, some background. ABC debuted Extreme Makeover Home Edition on February 15, 2004. This show depicted severe conditions of American poverty. Specifically, I remember a family of 5 living in a single room and a family of 15 living in a trailer. Every episode followed a set format. The Extreme team introduced a family in crisis, showcased their problematic house, sent the family on vacation, demolished the house, built a new one, and revealed it to the overjoyed family and their cheering community 7 days later. The show generally had a very positive and uplifting tone despite featuring some families with very devastating stories. The show was a ratings hit, with 20 million weekly viewers in 2006, and it remained popular throughout the crush of the housing crisis that many Americans were facing in real life during the Great Recession. The show also inspired a lot of off-screen community action, leading to donations of time, money, gifts, and scholarships. And it truly did seem to help families long after the cameras stopped rolling. Now, there are what I would consider 3 levels of being in or out of the loop when it comes to the show's aftermath and criticisms. The first and most shallow level is that people assume the show was just as incredible as it looked. The second level, where I think most people tuned into social commentary about reality television tend to sit, is that the show was actually quite harmful. If you watch Patrick CC's video from 2023, for example, you might be here at this level. Let's hang out here at this second level for a moment. The criticisms of the show began early, while it was still on air. Here are 3 of the biggest ones. First, in 2006, a leaked memo revealed that the show had a wish list of victims for featured families. This included a child with a rare medical condition that would cause rapid aging and early death. Second, critics questioned the ethics of building large mansions in modest neighborhoods, which highlight wealth disparities. These blatant portrayals of wealth disparity could discourage potential buyers of smaller homes in the neighborhoods, making it difficult to determine fair market value. And finally, another criticism was the overconsumption promoted by the extravagant home amenities, which often burden struggling families with excessive upkeep. Patrick CC's video does a great job at highlighting some of these, showing the hot tub they put in one child's room and the walls of reptiles that they put in another. Now, there is one more very big piece of criticism we'll discuss in a moment, but let's work through these 3 for now. I think these are valid criticisms, but I would like to add some other perspectives. A few years ago, Ty Pennington defended the show, saying, yeah, TV is about ratings and ad sales. It's not clear which specific criticism he was refuting here, but if this is about the victim wish list, perhaps what he meant was that emotional stories draw in more viewers, and more viewers mean higher prices for ad space. The victim wish list is personally my biggest qualm with the show. However, I do think it's important to note that victim wish list was the name that the press had for the memo and not the network. Maybe it is a bit sensationalist. Next, in response to criticisms 2 and 3, the show actually took these to heart in later seasons and reduced the extravagant features that they put into the homes and started incorporating storylines about helping families find meaningful, sustainable employment. Now, of course, none of this means that we shouldn't or can't criticize the show, and for what it's worth, in my opinion, I think that these 3 pieces of criticism that we just mentioned do hold up quite well. But I do think that many of us end up on this level 2, as I call it, believing that this show was nothing but terrible due to one major reason outside of these 3. That reason is that many people ultimately lost their homes due to things like increased property taxes after the value of their home dramatically jumped. But when you dig a bit more into it, we can see that statistics and the show's protocol actually paint a different picture. While many families didn't get to keep their homes in the end, this often wasn't the fault of the show. This brings us to our 3rd level, that maybe the show wasn't that bad. In a peer-reviewed article by Michelle Shihara published in Postmodern Culture, Shihara demonstrates that the show made massive efforts to ensure sustainability. Some of these efforts included finding sponsors and communities to set up utility funds, providing financial counseling to families, and, perhaps most importantly, selecting families who were, quote, poor, but never truly destitute. Shihara points out that out of 209 families on the show, only 5 faced significant financial trouble, which is less than 3% of the families that were featured. The author compares this number with the, quote, 50% default rates in the worst tranches of the mortgage-backed securities, during the housing bubble and ensuing crisis. Shihara points out that despite the scandalized coverage of a handful of foreclosures, in terms of the financial crisis, that, quote, the show's families actually did much better than the national average. In short, when keeping in mind the overarching economic circumstances, the author points out that it's actually quite remarkable that there were so few homes that ended up in foreclosure. Now, it's important to know that this article, while it breaks down some important realities about the families who actually lost their extreme makeover homes, and repeatedly calls the few examples of foreclosure scandalized, is certainly not a commercial for the show. This article is quite critical of the program overall, but these criticisms are not quite the topics of the more public discourse related to the show that we've already discussed. Most of the author's criticisms are, however, relevant to the theme of this video. Was there a hidden agenda? Keep in mind that central belief of neoliberalism that we talked about before, that people don't need government assistance, that helping others in crisis is not something that people should have to pay for via taxes. Now, also keep in mind that important criterion for securing a spot on the show, that families could be poor but never truly destitute. Consider this other quote from Shihara's article. The show's primary intentions included this drive to hide the true range of suffering of working families of all colors, suffering that might demonstrate the need for collective action or explicit governmental policies beyond an occasional, carefully bestowed mansion. In other words, wealthy television networks and celebrities helping out individual families with charitable gifts, time, and money may just create the illusion for viewers at home that humanity and society are doing just fine. People who need help get it. And by keeping the emphasis on individual problems, perhaps the show's audience could also take home the message that all families in need of a safer or more sustainable living space are families that have just had some bad luck, not that they are living in systems of poverty that take great financial capital to escape, and that maybe anyone who is suffering just needs some charity. Remember at the beginning of this chapter when I mentioned that the show had been about people living in some severe conditions of poverty, like the family of 5 living in a single room and the family of 15 living in a trailer? It turns out that I had forgotten some of the nuance to these stories. The trailer I'm remembering was a new and temporary arrangement for the Beach family due to Hurricane Ike damaging their house. The dining room situation I'm remembering was the Kilgallen family, 4 kids and a single mother who did own a house on which the mother was making mortgage payments. The problem with the Kilgallen home was that at purchase, it had been undisclosed that internally it was falling apart from termite damage. So she was paying for the house while living in her parents' dining room with her 4 children. For both the Beaches and the Kilgallens, they had enough money to have houses to begin with, and despite their terrible luck of getting caught in a hurricane and getting scammed into buying a crumbling house, these situations aren't actually examples of people suffering from the conditions associated with systemic poverty, nor poverty traps. To conclude this chapter, I'll share my own personal thoughts on this show that I came up with after researching and writing the chapter. To be honest, it feels a little wrong to say anything nice about the show when remembering that leaked memo. At the same time, I was kind of surprised at how well the show did work to help people overall. I don't know if the show is worth boisterously celebrating though, because it really does reveal some ugly cracks in society's foundation. Then again, it's also kind of a great thing that we can see and acknowledge these cracks if we just take a closer look at the show. None of what I have just listed are the faults of the show. However, whether a show should play along with these cultural norms and systems rather than fight against them is a big question. After all, what kind of show could really work to fix these issues? What would that even look like? How could it be interesting? How could it get viewers, let alone the 20 million viewers per week that Extreme Makeover Home Edition polled? Feel free to answer any of these questions or to comment your thoughts on this show below. But if you pause the video to write a comment, don't forget to come back, because we're about to talk about a show that was my guilty pleasure, The Simple Life. Chapter 4. The Simple Life. What was the point? In case you forgot, The Simple Life was an unscripted comedy starring Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie. The concept was that they, who admitted to never working jobs before,
I never had a job. Ever. Did you? I've never
and who were depicted as spoiled, elite, and constantly shopping, would move in with host families in working class communities and work real-world jobs. It would go horribly, which is where the humor and content mostly came from. They would act silly at their best and mess everything up at their worst. As a middle schooler with little autonomy over my day-to-day life, one who was riddled with anxiety about getting in trouble for stepping a toe out of line, there was something cathartic about this show. Watching Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie laugh in the face of authority and get away with it was not only funny for me, but it was also exciting. It actually made me feel hopeful that someday I too, a child who was tired of following all the rules other people made me follow, could someday laugh when I wanted to laugh, rest when I wanted to rest, and say whatever it was I wanted to say. But of course, not everyone watching was an anxious adolescent living those awkward tween years in a swing state. So what was it that others thought when watching? Well, no one could really agree. When you search for reviews from the show's first seasons, you get mixed results, of course. Some wrote it off as a goofy show that people likely watched as a guilty pleasure, and some reviewers wrote angry, unfocused, and slightly unhinged satirical pieces that took up an entire newspaper page in order to drill home the idea that these women were bad role models for girls. Other reviewers seemed to grant permission for the public to like it, but under a few conditions. That we should only be enjoying it if we're mocking Paris and Nicole and celebrating moments where the two actually get hurt, and, of course, realizing, again, that they are bad role models for young girls. Most peculiarly, however, many reviewers themselves couldn't seem to get a grasp on their own consistent interpretation. Like the one that called Paris and Nicole Dumb and Dumber, but just a few paragraphs down said that they were only pretending to be stupid. So which one is it? When I decided to make this video, I knew that I had to include a chapter about the simple life. It dealt with economic conditions, with class differences, and also, I remember quite well that anytime you could peep a marquee in the background of the show, other than the one that Paris and Nicole fixed up with these words while working at Sonic, you could always spot a patriotic message in a world fresh after 9/11. So what was it, I wondered, that scholars would say about the show? Was the show touting the ideals of neoliberalism in ways that I missed as a tween? Or was the show perhaps a warning against the emptiness and vapidness of overconsumption and billionaire culture? Well, somehow, even though you can find plenty of peer-reviewed scholarly research articles about shows like Honey Boo Boo, The Jersey Shore, 90 Day Fiancé, Laguna Beach, Extreme Makeover Home Edition, Survivor, American Idol, and dozens more, I can't find even one peer-reviewed article that examines the simple life. But I have some ideas about why this might be. First of all, the show comes off as unserious and also low stakes, unlike other reality shows that promise to do something important, like save a family or make a career. Perhaps this goofy show doesn't seem worth studying, at least not at first glance. But if someone were to think that it was worth a deeper look, I think it might be hard to know where to start with an analysis, at least from a socio-political perspective. Just as the stars of the show were chaotic in the workplace, the messaging and tone of the show was often chaotic as well. I mean that just when you think it is in fact a celebration of the working class in a post-9/11 country running on patriotism and hard, honest work, you see someone representative of that white trash stereotype we talked about earlier, acting foolish and wearing a t-shirt that makes polite society cringe. And just when you think it's a celebration of wealth and consumerism, you get a moment where Paris and Nicole start to regret their vapid, nihilistic attitudes because it embarrassed their kind and caring working-class host family. And while of course the world isn't black and white, it's odd that there isn't one focused socio-political narrative here. It would be like if Survivor took a turn and decided that everyone was going to win the show because they were all working equally as hard. I also understand that some will make the argument that it's just not that serious, and that it's just a reality show meant to be mindless and funny. But that's hard to accept about a show that engages with so many themes of class, wealth, gender roles, and societal norms in ways that I think warrant deeper thought and analysis. So, what can we definitively say about the way that it handles these themes? Well, at the very least, this show does achieve one thing in the socio-political landscape. It proves that there are, in fact, social classes, that we do live differently depending on wealth, and that we are not all residing in the same America. No one seems to disagree with this, even as the show seems to volley between siding with the stars and the working class. To me, the show feels a bit like the mirror of Erised in Harry Potter. I think that this show is just as covertly politically charged as any other reality TV show, but not through its messaging. Instead, it's politically charged in the way that it reflects our own political thoughts and feelings back. If someone is fearing that women behaving far outside of gender norms is a threat to society, they can rail against the show's personalities for playing a part in society's downfall. If someone felt they were morally superior to Paris and Nicole due to their participation toiling away in working society, mocking these two and the show could be an outlet for their frustrations. If someone wanted something tangible to link to their anxieties about class and culture wars, they got it. And if someone wants to say maybe it's not that serious, well, I think we've got that one too. And for me, a middle schooler in the Midwest with no real grip on politics, well, I saw what was in my mind an exciting rebellion from the stupid rules that I felt were part of a system of grave injustice. In my opinion, the show had some strange magical powers and had the potential to serve as a mirror if we dared to gaze into it. And even though I do agree with the critics who watched the show retrospectively and said that it hasn't aged well, there is one very special thing that we can say about this show. Its inconsistent socio-political narrative, whether about class and wealth, societal values, or gender roles, reflect the complexity of reality TV's place in our culture. We expect a show about these topics to say something, and when it doesn't say it eloquently, we can't help but swoop in with our own interpretations. What are yours? Chapter 5, Outro. Thank you for being here. Tell me, what was your favorite reality show? What do you think of the idea that reality shows have political agendas? Is it possible that they aren't always trying to influence voters and minds? Which of these shows did you watch? What other shows should I cover? Make sure you subscribe so that you can see it when it happens. We've got other videos coming up about some nostalgic early 2000s pop culture topics like the American Girl franchise, some other TV shows, and the business of children's advertising. If any of this sounds interesting, please do subscribe, or if you have other nostalgic pop culture topic ideas, drop them in the comments. See you again. Thanks.